Welcome everyone to the last class of the secular calendar. We will be continuing as normal, God willing, next Wednesday, January 7th. We will take one day off this month for the yeshiva break, which is, I believe, the week of the 26th. But otherwise, we're rocking on through the cusp of the secular new year. And I hope you enjoy the extra and special foods that we have prepared. I'm not allowed to tell you that we have a special donor who wishes the donation to remain completely anonymous. Even the fact that there's an anonymous donor is supposed to be anonymous, so you'll have to wipe that entirely from your mind. But obviously in honor of the auspicious occasion that this is the eve of the fast of the 10th of Teves, we had to have a special meal with champagne and things like that. So
if I knew, I would have eaten earlier.
But it's also, life is tough, as my father, Henry Abramson, always used to say. And whenever we have a chance to get together and wish each other any happy occasion, we should definitely chaperein and wish each other a happy new year, secular calendar-wise, and let's hope that we should share many simchas together over coming years. Amen. Okay, so that's the good and welfare. The joke. Today we're talking about a Talmudic topic, a very important Talmudic figure. So I'd like to tell a Talmudic joke. It's been a while since I told this one. It happens to be one of the funniest jokes I know, therefore I repeat it quite often. So I hope that you'll forgive me if you remember this joke. The joke centers around this halachic device that many communities use, including our own here in Surfside, of the Eruv. Right, so you remember the joke? The Eruv is, I hope you don't remember the joke. Oh, good. The Eruv is essentially it's a construction. Usually it's a wire, or it can use natural phenomena, rivers, things like that, to create a single courtyard, so to speak, so that all the Jews who live there are, as it were, living in a single entity. And this has tremendous utility for the Sabbath. Oops, we lost the image. I have to make sure I do this occasionally. This has tremendous utility for the Sabbath because the Sabbath rules otherwise prohibit Jews from carrying on the Sabbath, like keys in their pockets, things like that, or pushing strollers, things like that. So it's often filled with controversy. Quite often people who are, because these are difficult things to construct, people do not rely on them, especially people of a very high level of piety. They say, you know what, I'm not going to rely on the Eruv, I don't hold with the Eruv. It's also a lot of controversy because quite often when you build an Eruv, that makes a neighborhood more attractive to Orthodox Jews. And if you don't happen to like Orthodox Jews and what they do for the property values, then you may oppose the Eruv, as happens quite often here in the United States. So the joke goes like this. There are two chevrusas, two study partners. They're sitting in yeshiva learning together. And they're learning and studying the Talmud back and forth. And one day, Reuven says to his friend Shimon, I have to confess something. We've been learning together for many years, and we've grown so much in our appreciation of Torah and so on, and I have to tell you, I've been hiding something from you, and I think it's time I actually fessed up and told you the truth. And Shimon says, what are you talking about, Reuven? And he says, well, the truth is I'm not Jewish. And Shimon says, what are you talking about? You are so careful with your kashrut. We're sitting here learning Talmud in yeshiva. Your Hebrew skills are amazing. Your Aramaic is great. You can paskin daven from the Amud. You do all these religious things. He says, no. The truth is, I'm not Jewish. It just happened like that. I was walking down the street in Jerusalem one day. I was traveling on my way to Saudi Arabia, and someone said, do you want to have a Shabbos meal? So I said, okay, why not? And one thing led to another, and I really enjoyed it. And here I am. Nobody ever really asked me if I was Jewish. They just schlepped me around. So, and I'm not Jewish. And he says, well, you live a completely Jewish lifestyle. He says, well, actually, the truth is, I violate the Sabbath every week. I don't tell people, but I violate the Sabbath every week because actually, in Talmudic law, a non-Jew is actually not allowed to observe the Sabbath in all its details. I violate the Sabbath every week in order to keep, in conformity with Talmudic law. So he says, I don't believe it. He says, yeah, it's true. Like, for example, I carry my keys on the Sabbath. And he says, yeah, but Reuven, we have an Eruv. And he says, I don't hold by the influence. All right, I think I need to like bulk that one up a little bit. But okay, here we are. Let's go to the material. That's what you came for, not for the jokes. But I did get an email, a comment from someone in, oh, I forgot where it was from, saying we need more jokes. So I have to call them out. Okay, so tonight's topic is the Rashba. Very Talmudic topic. It's a great honor for me to have the opportunity to speak about him because he, as a thinker, really had a big influence on my own Talmudic education. There's no question. He's an overwhelmingly important figure in the yeshivas. You may not have heard of him. I meant to ask Denise Malka, my daughter, who is now doing the filming. Mr. Rodriguez has gone on to take graduate courses on Wednesday night, so my daughter Denise Malka is going to be filming. Denise Malka, in your extensive education, have you ever heard of the Rashba? She has. How about Rafaela? You're in the back there. Have you heard of the Rashba? Okay, so my daughters happen to be exceptionally well educated. But I think outside of yeshiva, chances are you'd never hear the name Rashba because he's so deeply associated with the Talmud, which is not necessarily taught in women's seminaries. He was a tremendous leader of Spanish Jewry in the heroic 13th century, right towards the end of the Spanish Golden Age. And as we'll see, he was not only renowned for his incisive wit and his encyclopedic knowledge of traditional Jewish law, but also for his tremendous leadership qualities. In many ways, he is eclipsed only by figures like Nachmanides, his teacher, or like Maimonides, who comes from the same era. If we lived at this time in the late 12th century, we would have regarded Rashba as one of the shining stars of the Jewish constellation. And in fact, his light extends even to the present day, where we still live very much by his teachings. The name Rashba itself is an acronym, like so many of these rabbis had names that were made of the parts of a longer name. Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham Adret, sometimes vowelized Aderet, but he's known as the Rashba. Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham, the Rashba. And his years are 1235 to 1310. He's associated with Barcelona in particular. That's where his life was most active. So let's place him in the context of Jewish history. He is one of the most famous of the generations known as the Rishonim. So according to Jewish philosophy of time, there are sort of large chunks of generations that can be grouped together, primarily for theological reasons, but it also has implications for how Jews work through Talmudic law. And the concept behind the grouping of these generations is the notion that the closer that Jews were to the revelation at Sinai, the greater the level of spiritual sensitivity, the greater the level of openness to Torah and to divine information and so on. Not necessarily greater intelligence, not necessarily greater sophistication. Those things actually come later because you have the ability to access much more information than earlier generations. But the idea is that they were on a higher plane than later generations. And in Jewish philosophy of time, we break them up into several groups, which is outlined in Pirkei Avot. The period that we're especially looking at right now is known as the Rishonim, or the first ones. It's a little bit of a misleading term because there were periods before the Rishonim, the Geonim, the Amoraim, the Tanaim, and so on. But the Rishonim is really the first major generation after the Talmud has been completely written. The previous period, the Geonim, there were certain tractates of the Talmud which were still under production. The Rishonim is the first generation when the Talmud is already canonized, and so they are the first major commentaries on the Talmud in particular. Famous Rishonim that I'm sure you're familiar with, Rashi, who is exemplary of the Rishonim because one of the main tasks of these few hundred years of scholars was explaining the basic text. Rashi is famous for his very pithy, concise, and revealing commentary on the Talmud and the Torah in particular. You also have the Rishonim who engage in codifying law, meaning taking all of the complexities of Jewish law, which is scattered throughout a vast corpus of literature, and then bringing it down to an organized fashion where it's all set out more or less in Greek terms with chapters and sections and subsections, things like that. The Rambam, Maimonides, shown here in a statue from Cordoba, is perhaps the most famous of the Rishonim who were engaging in codes. You also have the so-called Monei HaMitzvot, those who counted the mitzvot. As I think I mentioned just a couple weeks ago, but I'll repeat it, why not? The Talmud says there are 613 commandments. The Talmud does not list them. So by the time you get the Rishonim, around the turn of the 10th century, several rabbis say, well, okay, let's put these down on paper. What are the 613 commandments? And of course, then they have a difference of opinion, which ones should be in, which ones should not be in, which ones are just customary or rabbinic and so on. But that's something that the Rishonim do, is they try to analyze and synthesize so that we have the Torah presented in a very different format than the earlier passages. So these are the kinds of things that the Rishonim engaged in very heavily, and the Rashba is firmly in that tradition. The most significant area of his work in terms of literature is his activity as a writer of responsa. So the term responsa is Latin, and it is the plural of responsum, which is the same word as we have in English, response, answer. Basically, it would go like this. And by the way, this is the way it works even in the 21st century. A typical Jew would have a question in the observance of Jewish law. He would ask his wife what to do. She would tell him, he would disagree, and so therefore he would be forced to go to the rabbi to find out that his wife was actually correct all along. But in the meantime, what would happen is the rabbi, by the way, should I tell the personal story? No, don't tell the personal story? Well, one daughter says no, the other says yes. But I'll tell you quickly, I won't give you all the details, but basically, one of the reasons my wife and I, thank God, we've married 26 years this year. Thank you, that's right, 26 years. And, oh my gosh, I got so many jokes running through my head, but I can't put them on the internet because then I'll get in trouble. But let's say we've been married 26 years, and one of the reasons why our marriage is so stable is because long ago we agreed that whenever we had a dispute that we could not resolve between the two of us, we would go to the rabbi. That was it. We're going to go to the rabbi. And we did that for a long time until finally I gave up. And I said, what's the point? Right? Every time we go to the rabbi, he agrees with her. So now we have a dispute and we do it her way. That's how we compromise, and it works out. That wasn't so funny, right? No, I'm in trouble. Okay, now. Maybe I'll cut it out of the internet. Anyways, here's how it goes. A typical Jew has a problem. He goes to his rabbi. Rabbi, what do I do about this situation? I got involved in this business deal, and it didn't go well, and he says I owe him money. I tell him I don't owe him any money. What do I do? The rabbi tries to answer it in the best of his knowledge, but if it turns out that if it's beyond his capability to answer, he'll pass it on to a higher rabbi. And this is all, by the way, decided by consensus, not by any sort of formal mechanism. Who's like a more well-learned rabbi, and that rabbi may pass it on to another rabbi until you have someone who is known informally as the Gadol Hador, the great one of the generation. Once again, it's not a formal designation that you can somehow be elected to become the Gadol Hador. It's just based on consensus where enough people agree that, yeah, this person represents the apex of learning in our generation, and he, typically he, becomes the person that people turn to. The Rashba, and by the way, because we're talking about Jews, it's rare in any generation that you will have an absolute agreement on one person. There will always be several, maybe half a dozen, that various groups regard as the Gadol Hador, living at the same time. We did have a generation like that about 40 years ago. There was a widespread consensus that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was considered the Gadol Hador across all movements, but that's very rare and very brief and only episodic in Jewish history. It was the case in the era of the Rashba. He was clearly the Gadol Hador. To him were addressed all of these very vexing and difficult questions, and he composed written responses to them all around the Mediterranean basin, in particular in Spain and also in Provençal and various parts of Central Europe. And communities would cherish these letters from the Rashba, and they would become, copied over and over again into their communal records and recirculated and so on. And later on, it may have taken several hundred years, they were eventually published over 3,500 of these letters, these responses in Jewish law, have been preserved and have been published and continue to be studied to this day. So he was extremely active. Maybe to put it in kind of a flippant way, he was sort of like a Dear Abby. Is that the name of the column? Dear Abby? He was kind of like Dear Abby, except for Jewish law. You know, people really paid attention to what he had to say. Okay, let me pause for questions before I look at more specifics in his life. Yes, Judith.
It's not a question, but it's an observation that what we have here and what you're describing is very much like the early chapters in early Christianity, when people, very oftentimes Jews in the diaspora would have heard, and they were writing, and some of your gospel is actually responsa.
What do you mean by my gospel?
No, so some of it is gospel.
Yes,
it's responsa to which
sure,
they call
we have
gospel.
letters, acts, right? A lot of Peter's writings, Paul's writings are like that particularly. You're absolutely right. This is not a new form of writing, but it is definitely one that's very much associated with the Jews, and of course the early Christians are following in that tradition as well. Oh, I would be interested to see if the Greco-Roman world did things like this too. But certainly in the Jewish world, responsa are extremely important. And by the way, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, responsa literature is still being created today. It's really quite fascinating to see all kinds of questions, which are usually initiated by technological innovations or social innovations. You know, what is a microwave? Is a microwave an oven? In which case you have to treat it with all the laws that pertain to an oven. So if you cook meat in it and then you want to cook milk in it, you have to kosher it. How do you kosher the inside of a microwave oven? Not the way I did it one Passover, putting a cup of water in there for an hour, thinking that was the right way to do it. And in fact, I actually broke the glass plate and the metal buckled on the inside, and it was history. The Tzitz Eliezer, very famous gadol, one of the great ones of the generation in Israel, who ruled on issues of sex change. You know, this is something that was not possible for most of human history, and now when it's possible physically to affect the sex change, what does that mean in Jewish law? And you would be surprised that he actually ruled that, first of all, it's forbidden. You know, that's not surprising. But he ruled that once it's done, it's done. Like, the person would actually change to be regarded as the other sex. It's a lot more complicated than I'm saying right now. I think it has different implications for marriage and so on. But these are technological, social innovations that responsa writers would have to deal with, and they would have these questions addressed to them regularly. Okay, so let's go on. His background. He came from a very well-to-do family of moneylenders. We spoke about them a couple of weeks ago in the lecture of Aaron of Lincoln, talked about the institution of money lending as a practice. And he was actually quite gifted in his business acumen. Already at a very early age, he achieved tremendous success, building on his family's wealth. And among the people who owed him money were, in fact, the King of Aragon. Like, even as a young man, he was already parlaying his wealth into tremendous resources. But he ended up leaving his wealth to become a communal rabbi. He retired. By the age of 40, he took the position of the Rabbi of Barcelona, which was one of the most important communities of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. And this is really when the Rashba becomes the man that he would be renowned for many centuries. He was especially known for his impeccable integrity and his absolute unswavering dedication to the law as he saw it appropriately interpreted through Talmudic vision. Early on in and he was especially impervious to bribery. There was nothing that could shake him from his position, regardless of the forces arrayed against him. To give you just a couple of examples, in one case, early on in his career, he was called to adjudicate a case where an orphan who had a substantial estate was disputing with some wealthy Jewish aristocrats and their wealthy Christian nobles who were supporting the Jewish aristocrats, arguing that they were unfairly encroaching upon his estate. And here's a young child without parents, and the Rashba staunchly defended early on in his career this young child against much greater powers that were arrayed against him. But on the other hand, another case that indicates how he, his integrity was sacrosanct to his activity. There was a case brought against a Jew who was accused of informing against the state. And the Rashba did not want to hear the case. The secular state, Aragon, drew him in and said, "We want you to review this case and tell us what you think about what we should do with this Jew." After an exhaustive review, and again, he tried to recuse himself, but the king demanded, so he participated. After an exhaustive review of the evidence, he ruled that the person was in fact a traitor and deserved death. This is a very, very grave ruling, particularly in Jewish law. The idea of putting someone to death, especially without a Sanhedrin of 71 judges, is considered a very, very difficult, almost impossible thing to do. But there are some rare exceptions where it would be permitted if it presented, for example, a threat to the community as a whole. The ticking time bomb kind of example. So he ruled against the Jew in this case and ordered him to be put to death. The family appealed, and the king agreed to forward the Rashba's decision to the great Maharam of Rothenburg in central Germany. Very important figure we spoke about a few years ago. And the Maharam upheld the ruling of the Rashba, and in fact the Jew was put to death. But we see on the one hand, here he is defending the innocent orphan against tremendous moneyed wealth arrayed against him, and at the same time we see him standing up for the rights of the state against an individual Jew who was accused of informing on them. He was so well regarded that King Pedro III actually called upon him quite often to adjudicate between Jewish communities, that the state regarded him as the Gadol Hador, kind of like Lord Sachs in England, that sort of thing, where his moral authority was so great that it penetrated the Jewish boundaries and went well into the non-Jewish world as well. He was regarded as, Lahavdil, the Dalai Lama of the time, that everyone regarded him so well as a paragon of virtue and intelligence, and someone who could not be swayed to render unfair judgments. He established a yeshiva and attracted some brilliant minds to him. I should mention, by the way, his background in terms of his education is quite fascinating. He was educated at the feet of two of the greatest scholars of the era. One was Rabbeinu Yonah of Gerona. I think Gerona is pronounced Herona. Is that correct? Herona? Herona. Okay, that's good. Actually, it's funny. There's a gas station called Chevron, Chevron, and my youngest son always pronounces it Chevron. Thinks it's like Abraham's birthplace, Chevron. There it is. So, what a name for a gas station. So, anyways, Rabbeinu Yonah is especially known for his glorious book Sharei Tshuva, the Gates of Repentance, which is one of the classics of Jewish literature, which it's called the Gates of Repentance because it describes in tremendous detail how to repent for the wrongs of your past. Like, for example, in the section on regret, he lists 20 different forms of regret, 20 different ways to express your regret, and 20 different sort of nuances of regret. And the book is like a tremendously heavy tome of that nature. Very, very good for introspective reading. And at the same time, he was also educated by Nachmanides, Ramban, who was, the older scholar, the last Gadol Hador before the Rashba, who was extremely involved in all aspects of Torah study, including the Talmud and including the Kabbalah, which we're going to get to shortly, one of the acts most famously associated with the Rashba's activity. So he had really tremendous teachers behind him, the Rabbeinu Yonah and the Ramban in particular, and then when he established his yeshiva, he was able to commit these values to a later generation, and a few of his students include the famous Ritva. Again, if you spend many time in yeshiva, you will study the works of the Rashba and the Ritva. They seem to go hand in hand altogether, and they really did, because the Ritva was the Rashba student. and also Rabbeinu Bachaya, who wrote a very famous interpretation of the Torah, a commentary on the Torah that is studied to this day. So again, we have to get the whole picture of this man, very wealthy, and yet his wealth gave him his independence to be able to focus solely on Torah. Regarded as a peerless leader of sterling moral character that was respected by Jew and non-Jew alike, and very much involved in ruling on issues that spread throughout the Jewish world. Again, 3,500 individual pieces of correspondence. If you work that out, if his career lasted about 40 years, so let's see, how many is that? 3,500? It's about 80 or 90 letters a year, right? That's a huge amount. That's like 2 big letters a week. And these are very learned letters that have tremendous amounts of Talmudic knowledge packed into each one of them. Okay. Now, of course, since we are talking about Jews, there's going to be some dispute involved. And I'd like to concentrate on 3 main areas in which the Rashba was involved in some very significant disputes, which persist in some way to the present day. As we have a teaching in Pirkei Avot, one of the great classics of ancient Jewish literature, any controversy that is for the sake of heaven, the controversy will endure. Meaning if people are arguing really for the truth and for the betterment of the human race, then that controversy is not going to be just solved. If the controversy is solved, it means maybe it wasn't so much for the side of truth. And so we see that very much so with the Rashba, particularly in his dispute over secular knowledge. I'll pause again for questions and drink a little bit of coffee. Rafaela, my eldest daughter, no questions?
Who do you think is the Gadol Hador of this generation? Do we have any?
Oh, who do I think? This is definitely not going to the internet. Who do I think is the Gadol Hador of this generation? I don't know.
I mean, there's no one like Feinstein, right?
No one, I think. I mean, yeah, I don't know who. Every now and then, it's a very hard thing. I had someone at my Shabbos table who was talking about one particular Gadol Hador. I'm not going to say whose name he was, but he's definitely a brilliant mind. Like Rav Ovadia Yosef is a brilliant mind with tremendous amount of knowledge and really entertaining. I'm not talking about him, but this other person made some rulings that I personally found crazy. I found them crazy, and I'm not a learned person. I mean, I read it, I said, why are we deciding this? This is something that's so, and the decisions that he made, if I tell you the decisions, you know who I'm talking about, so I don't want to say that. But he made decisions that were popularized, and a lot of Jews lost a lot of money as a result. They said, oh, we can't do this anymore, and then all of a sudden they sold property that belonged to them because they felt that that was the thing to do. And later I heard from someone who was close to him in his final years that a lot of questions never actually reached him. A lot of questions were decided by underlings who said, oh, this is too important for him, not important enough for him to look at, and so they'd write it in his name. That's a scary phenomenon. But I'd blather. Yes, Rafaela?
Was Rabbi Stona his teacher before or after he wrote Shari Tshuva?
He was teacher after he wrote Shari Tshuva. So after the Maimonidean controversy. Brilliant question. Okay. All right. So what's going on here? Now, one of the interesting things that's developed in the 13th century, 2 extra things really, but let's focus on the first one first. Judaism as a body of thought was bifurcating. It was getting more complicated, and there were people who were specializing in certain avenues of research more than others. One of the last great synthesis, well, I shouldn't say it like that. Let me back up and just change the way I say that a little bit. There were 3 main bodies of thought among the Jews of the 13th century about how to approach Torah. You had the allegorists, many highly rationalistic Jews, many of whom came from Arabic lands and also from Spain, who felt that the Torah as a whole must be understood as a massive allegory, kind of like in a philonic sense, that it's not everything that's said in the Torah should be taken exactly as it's written. it's all meant to mean something else. And of course, the danger inherent in that way of thinking is that you can, all of the commandments then become debatable. Well, mind you, we debate them anyways. But there's no hard and fast rules. There's no horizon. There's no common denominator. If you want to say that, like for example, if you want to say that, it's forbidden to, let's say, I have to find an easy one. Thou shalt not steal, let's say. So they can say, well, I'm not actually stealing if I photocopy this book and then sell it. That's not actually stealing, right? Because I didn't actually take anything away. It was a library book. I put it back in the library. Now I'm making money from the photocopy I made of this book, right? And you can make all kinds of allegories. You can say when it says this kind of word, it really means something else, and so on. And so there was a trend in the Jewish world that was excessively rationalistic and taking the Torah away from its basic meaning. Then there was a group on the other side who were highly Kabbalistic, who were reading everything not as a rationalist allegory, but as a mystical allegory, and reading everything meaning something totally divorced from the simple text says. And then finally you had sort of a moderate camp that was trying to distance themselves from both extremes, and the Rashba found himself in the middle of a dispute over this. And especially where it became most pointed is in the place of secular knowledge. What do you do with mathematics, physics, chemistry, astronomy, all of the sciences that were growing in this 13th century? What exactly are you supposed to, what is their place in the Jewish curriculum? So as you might assume, the rationalists said, wow, it should be, deeply entrenched in the Jewish curriculum. There should be, lots of study of physics and of astronomy and so on. Jews should know tons of that stuff. The Kabbalists said, not at all, because all of this stuff, this is Chochmas Hagoyim, non-Jewish wisdom. It is mitame, it defiles the Jewish soul. Jews should just stick to the 4 cubits of the Talmud alone and not study any of this secular wisdom. And the moderate camp in the middle was really, there are arguments to be said for both in some ways, because the rationalists, when you study some of these things, there's worry that you'll be drawn away from basic faith and you'll be drawn into heresy, especially if you're studying, let's say, Greek philosophers with multiple gods and things like that. So they were concerned, how are they going to negotiate the two extremes here? So, and where this came to a head, by the way, was in the great debate over the works of Maimonides. This is what I meant to say a little earlier, and then I kind of stopped myself. Because Maimonides, although he was not a Kabbalist in the sense that we'd use this term a little later, he definitely believed in the simple meaning of the text, and yet he was also a great fan of secular knowledge. He believed that Aristotle, for example, was virtually a prophet among the non-Jews. He was like one level below the level of prophecy. And Aristotle's philosophy was very, very highly regarded by Maimonides, so much so that his Guide for the Perplexed, really borrows very heavily from the Greek philosopher. But his strong attachment to rationalism got him into great trouble with the allegorists in France and I'm sorry, I put that wrong. He got him into great trouble with those groups, the highly, mystically inclined Jews who felt that, what, we can't have any of this. This is completely wrong. And so in 1232, which is about the time when the Rashba was about 15 years old, Jews denounced in Paris. They denounced the works of Maimonides to the church. So Jews went to the Dominican order and they said, we have the works of this guy, everybody thinks he's so great, but the reality is he's teaching Jews not to believe in Judaism. And the church was very upset with this idea because, Jews are supposed to stay inside their own, communities, and if they start becoming non-believers or believing in paganism, then that's going to upset everything. So therefore, in the year 1232, in June of that year, the Dominicans took the works of Maimonides and they set them to the flames. 10 years later, they would follow up that by setting the Talmud itself to the flames. But Maimonides really met with the first criticism. And so there was this huge uproar. What are you supposed to do with Maimonides' approach to secular knowledge? Is it okay to study this stuff? Is it too dangerous to study? What's going to happen to Judaism if we allow all these gates open? Now, if I can jump ahead to the 21st century, the debate rages in Jewish schools even today. How much Torah belongs in a Jewish school system? Do you have Torah, for example, only taught in the mornings when the kids are a little more fresh, and that way they get their best energies devoted to the Torah, and then you squeeze in the secular subjects later in the day? That's a very expensive endeavor, especially if you hire full-time teachers and you can only employ them for a few hours a day. Or do you say, no, we'll mix up Torah here and secular studies there, and you might end up coming to school and do math first thing in the morning, and then when the teacher is free at the end of the day, then you'll learn a little bit of Chumash. Do we say that the balance should be 50-50? That if you have an 8-hour school day, 4 hours is secular and 4 hours is Torah? Or do we say, no, you know what? It's just enough that they come here and they learn a little bit, so let's have 70% is secular and 30% is Torah. And so the debate is still very much alive today. What exactly do we hold with this? What ended up happening is the Rashba was the only figure who had the stature to be able to set down a rule. In the so-called Compromise of 1305, he made a ruling which was basically held to the present day in many communities. Basically, he said, nobody is allowed to study philosophy until they're 25 years old. You want to study philosophy earlier? No way. It's too dangerous. There are too many crazy ideas. There's too much, narishkeit in there. So young people who want to study philosophy, you've got to wait till you're 25. Presumably by the time you're 25, you'll be married, you'll have kids, you'll have had Chinese food many times, you're very secure and stable, and then you can handle the questions of philosophy. But before that, definitely not. This would later feed into a ban on the study of Kabbalah until you're 40 years old. However, he exempted many non-Jewish sciences from the ban. Mathematics, okay from the very beginning. Physics, okay from the very beginning. So certain hard sciences, as we would call them today, that did not have any potentially ideologically risky components were permitted from the youngest ages. But any kind of sciences, and again, at that time, the distinctions between philosophy and mathematics were not that clear, but he was saying that anything that has an ideological tinge to it, it's all right, but only when you're older. Younger kids are not allowed to study that. And that compromise has basically directed Jewish education for the last 800 years. Okay, questions or arguments to this point?
Where did astronomy fit into this? I know they were very much into it.
Right. Astronomy is fascinating because it involves a lot of the hard sciences of mathematics and things like that, but it also slides over into astrology and the zodiac and all kinds of things like that. So astronomy was one of those sciences that he banned until 25. You have to be 25 to get to that. But a very important statement, and it essentially set to rest all of the disputes, because it was a ban that was clear, it was easy to follow, it was not too strict that people couldn't abide by it and so on. There's also an interesting sort of political dimension to this as well, because at this time, France in particular was beginning to centralize its government. And one of the issues that was of concern to the French community, I'm kind of rounding out France as a whole here, was that is it possible that we have Jews living in our country who are ruled by our hated Spanish rivals? Here's a Jew in Barcelona who's telling our French Jews what to do? That's not okay. And so, the Rashba was living in a time where these kinds of political disputes spilled over into religious ones. Yes?
All those rulings, I can understand how it affected, a certain age of a generation at that time. How did this affect the community as a whole? Children, anti-Semitism, marriages, mixed marriages, because the community was strong, but it doesn't mean that it was not certain with other.
Right. Well, it's an excellent question. More sophisticated than I can possibly answer all of those aspects of it. But I think that what is
Adoption.
yeah, those I really don't know enough about those aspects of life in Barcelona. I don't think anyone does actually. I haven't seen any research on those particular topics. What is clear though is that the Rashba's ruling was an illustration of the Talmudic proverb, the Rishonic proverb, Ein simcha keheter haspekot. There is no happiness like the resolution of doubt. Like when you don't know what's going to be, yes, no, is it going to work, not going to work. Once you know, that's a special kind of simcha. And so the Rashba, he resolved the doubt, and he had the kind of shoulders that could say, you know, this is what we're going to do, and everyone agrees to it. Like to give you another example of this kind of resolution of doubt, and we go to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, one of Rabbi Feinstein's most heroic rulings, really, one that was just overwhelming and had a phenomenal impact on world Jewry in a very concrete way, was his ruling on mamzerim. If you're familiar, one of the things that has occurred in the 20th century is, with the increasing divorce rate in America in particular, there are a lot of second marriages that did not take place under traditional Talmudic law. And children born to those second marriages could suffer an incredibly difficult stigma called mamzerut, which is more than an illegitimacy. It would mean that they would not be allowed to marry anyone except another mamzer or someone who converts into their faith. And their children would also have that same stigma. It's a stigma forever. And because so many people in America found themselves affected by this ruling, this was a crisis of incredible proportions. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was one of the unique figures who had the courage to find a solution to it. I won't say on the internet here what the solution is because it's really complicated. But basically he found a solution. He says, okay, everybody listen to me. This is exactly how we're going to solve the problem. And in fact, he solved it for the vast majority of people who would be facing mamzerut. An incredibly difficult decision to make. Was not without controversy, but that's what made him stand out as the Gadol Hador in particular. But let's go on. I got to do two more disputes. Okay, so he also was very involved in defending Judaism, particularly from attacks from without. This is a period when it was very popular to host so-called disputations, in which the church, usually with state support, would arrange for these kind of debates in which Jews were forced to participate in a debate against a Christian interlocutor, usually a Jewish convert to Catholicism. Perhaps the most famous of them was the Barcelona dispute of 1263, in which Nachmanides, the Rashba's teacher, faced off against Pablo de Cristiani, a convert to Christianity. And Nachmanides, we have both the Hebrew and the Latin account of what happened. Both sides say they won. What we know is that the court ruled, or the judges, who were all the Christian judges, ruled in favor of the Christian debater, but the king gave Nachmanides a huge amount of money and said, you better get out of the country because you're in trouble now for the very strong performance that you showed. And Nachmanides was banished. He ended up in Israel. These disputations proved to be very, very popular, and the Rashba was very active in participating in them whenever he was called to, and in particular in writing. He wrote tracts that criticized books like the Pugio Fide, the Fighter of the Faith, by Raymond Martini, a very important church thinker who criticized Judaism heavily. And he also wrote tracts against Ahmad ibn Khazam, who was a Muslim thinker who had written criticisms of Judaism. So he was very much active in the literary scene in defending Judaism against its detractors from without. And then finally, he was involved in defending himself, not surprisingly. Besides his responsa literature, and besides his commentary on the Talmud, which we haven't had much time to discuss, he also wrote a few sort of halachic volumes that deal with particular topics. One of these topics dealt with the laws of keeping kosher, and it was called Torat Habayit, the the teachings of the home, or the Torah of the home. And it was criticized within the realm of appropriate debate by another great thinker of the period, Aharon of Barcelona, who you may recognize. He is widely believed to be the anonymous author of the Sefer HaChinuch, shown here in a 5-volume Hebrew-English translation. We happen to have several copies in my house because it's a very popular bar mitzvah gift. It is actually the first, it itself was a bar mitzvah gift. It's a rather amazing book. Let me take a second to tell you what the book is about. The book is written anonymously, so it's attributed to Aaron of Barcelona, but we're not positive. And basically what he does is, he wrote this book for his son on the occasion of his bar mitzvah. It is organized according to each of the sections of the Torah, the parshiot of the Torah, and it goes through each of the 613 mitzvot in turn. And it says, a couple paragraphs about what the mitzvah is, how it is observed, and then most fascinatingly, and very uncommonly, he says why the mitzvah exists. The reasons behind the mitzvah, which most of the commentaries do not treat. I mean, God says this is the mitzvah, the commandment, and most commentaries just say that's what we're supposed to do. But the Chinuch actually provides reasons, which makes it an unusually fascinating book. At any rate, Aaron criticized the Torah Habayit. He wrote a book called Bedek Habayit, which means examination of the house. Like, if the house is so good, it can stand up to a little bit of criticism here, in which he took the Rashba to task politely on some of his ideas. So the Rashba apparently was not pleased with the criticism, and he anonymously wrote a defense of his work, written in the third person, meaning as if it was some other person wishing to defend Rashba. We find out from a later responsa that the Rashba was actually defending himself, and his book was called Mishmeret Habayit, guarding the house. So you have the laws of the house, the examination of the house, and then guarding of the house, all one kind of like triad of works that deal with it. So he was involved in, defending his own ideas against criticism as well. So when we take all of his works as a whole, we see that the Rashba has a phenomenal legacy. This, by the way, is the 5-volume set of his commentary on the Talmud alone, exempt, separate from the responsa literature and so on. The Rashba was a communal figure of tremendous proportion. He was an astute leader and a profound Talmudic thinker, very, very active in protecting the Jewish communities all around, both intellectually and in many ways on a leadership level. And perhaps the most lasting contribution to Jewish thought, besides his literary oeuvre, is his Compromise of 1305, which laid out the boundaries for the acceptable incorporation of non-Jewish wisdom into the Jewish educational curriculum. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and your endurance, as always. Next week, we're going to speak about Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, another scholar who was especially involved in translating Arabic wisdom into European languages, and one of the principal reasons why Jews made such a phenomenal contribution to world culture. Thank you for your participation. I can push the button. Okay. Let's turn this off here.